Welcome to the Best Interest Podcast, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Hello, and welcome to episode 80 of the Best Interest Podcast. My name is Jesse Kramer. Later in the episode, Evan Giokas will be joining me. Evan is the founder of the College Confidence Coach. And yes, Evan and I discussed some of the financial side of college and preparing your children for college, but we actually spend much more time diving into the non-financial aspects of helping teenagers make one of what perhaps will be one of the bigger decisions thus far in their lives. And so if you're a parent of a future college attendee, or perhaps you know such a parent in your lives, I think Evan's wisdom and expertise is fantastic and really worth listening to today. But first, let's do one of our customary reviews of the week. This one comes from Apple Podcasts, like all the other reviews, and it comes specifically from user Kells123321. Kells writes in and says, underrated and educational. I'm 30 episodes in. I love the relevant topics, how easy it is to understand. Jesse has a real skill for making digestible breakdowns of complex topics, as good as any finance podcast out there. Flies under the radar, deserves to get famous. Well, thank you, Kells. I'm not sure fame is in my future, Kells, but I appreciate your kind words. And you know what? If the podcast gets a little more traction because of nice reviews like this, I will take it, and I really appreciate it. So thank you, Kells. Send me an email, jesse@bestinterest.blog, and we'll get you hooked up with some pretty cool Best Interest gear, some swag, a nice soft t-shirt. And before Evan joins us for the main conversation today, I want to do my traditional little monologue and spend a little bit of time talking about two subtopics surrounding 529 college savings plans. So to start, for those unfamiliar, the 529 college savings plan is a tax-advantaged investment account meant specifically for educational expenses. As of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed in 2017, 529 plans can be used for college costs, for K through 12 public school costs, for private and or religious school tuition. And so if you ever need to pay for your child's education, then 529 plans are for you. Now, it's worth noting on that note that every state has its own 529 plan that they administer at a state level, and different states provide different levels of benefit for using 529s. And the thing that I said a couple sentences ago about using 529s for college or for high school, well, that can actually vary from state to state. So you'll want to make sure that your state's 529 plan or simply the 529 plan that you choose to use, because you don't actually have to use your own states, right? I live in New York. I use New York's, but if I wanted to, I could use California's plan. So that's important for you all to know. But whatever state plan you end up using, you'll want to know what you can use those $529 for. For college, yes. For high school, for middle school, maybe if they go to a private school, that kind of thing. Now, 529 plans, as you couldn't tell, right? It's a numbered plan. So it's got that similar kind of naming convention as a 401k. And that's because the name comes from the specific U.S. tax code where the plan was written into law. It's in section 529 of Internal Revenue Code 26. Now, that is very boring and doesn't really matter, but that's where the 529 gets its name. Now, there are tax advantages with the 529, and this is kind of the last thing I'll say from a very general point of view, is when you contribute money to a 529 plan, in many states, although not in all states, you get a state tax discount right up front. For example, in New York State, the first $10,000 that a couple contributes to a 529 is deductible from state taxes. So my marginal New York State tax is roughly around 6%. So I contribute $10,000. Kelly and I, my wife and I, as a couple, contribute $10,000 into a 529. We pay $600 less of tax, right? Very nice thing up front. But then you can invest the money in a 529 account and your investment grows tax-free. No federal taxes paid on investment growth, which is very nice. You don't have to pay taxes on dividends. You don't have to pay taxes on capital gains. That's all well and good. And then sometime in the future, when you withdraw money from the 529 in order to pay for a qualified educational expense like college tuition, there is no tax on withdrawing that money. So tax-free growth and tax-free withdrawals, as long as you're using the money for qualified educational expenses. That is the deal of 529s. The benefit are these really nice tax advantages. so long as you're using the money for the exact purpose of the plan, which is educational expenses. Now, there's a major downside, or at least I should say a significant downside of 529 plans that in some cases turns people off against them. And the downside is, or the question that people ask themselves is, what if I just save too much money in a 529 plan and I have extra money there that my kids don't end up using? What if my kid decides not to go to college and I don't use the money at all, and it's just sitting there in a 529 plan? What if they get a sports scholarship? What if they go into the military? All good questions, but really underlying all those questions is the fear that money will be put away in a 529 plan, will be saved diligently, will be invested smartly, but then come the future won't be used for any sort of educational expense. And then when the parents or whoever owns the 529 account wants to pull that money out, if they don't pull it out for an education expense, if they don't pull it out for a qualified expense, then the federal government comes in and says, hey, you aren't using the 529 plan appropriately. You aren't using it in the way that we intended. You aren't using it for educational expenses. Therefore, we are going to levy taxes against you because we've given you all this tax-free growth, and we're going to undo that. We're going to charge you what ends up being a regular income tax on any of the growth in the 529 plan, which can be significant. And then they also charge a 10% penalty on top of that. Now, when you actually run the math and you look at the benefits of using a 529 plan in the first place, once the income taxes have been charged and once the 10% penalty has been levied, you'll see that that really nullifies all the benefit of using the 529. So if you're going to have dollars left over in the 529 plan at the end of the day that you need to pull out because you have no other educational use for them, well, you are better off never putting those dollars in there in the first place. That is the rub. And that's the fear that many parents have to say, well, I'm not sure I want to use a 529 plan because what if the future holds some sort of unknown situation and the dollars aren't used for educational purposes and we want access to them? I don't want to have to pay that 10% penalty. I don't want to have to pay those extra income taxes. I'd rather just save for college some other way. So that brings us to the first of today's main topics, which I call the 50-50 rule for college saving. After a few real life conversations and running my own math, I've decided that a 50-50 rule for college saving achieves the best of both worlds. Now, I'll explain what 50-50 is and why I chose that. It's percentages, right? 50% and 50% adding up to 100. And as I go through this explanation, and I'll come back to this idea at the end too, it doesn't have to be 50-50. It could be 60-40 or 70-30. But just keep that in mind as I talk about 50-50 today. Now, the rule is 50% of your college savings goals should be saved via a 529 plan. The other 50% should be saved via a taxable brokerage account. Now, why is that the case? Well, let's first discuss what we do and what we don't want from our college savings plans. What we do want to save for college, all right, groundbreaking stuff there. We do want to reduce our income taxes, right? That's a good thing. We do want our investments to grow tax-free. Excellent. But we also do want flexibility while we save because life can throw us a curveball. Maybe our kids don't go to college. So we want flexibility if we can achieve it. And we don't want to end up with permanently frozen assets. We don't want leftover $529. So now the traditional 529 college savings plans, it offers some of those benefits. It achieves some of those goals we just laid out, but not all of them. In fact, 529 plans are actually terrible at achieving a couple of those goals we just mentioned. They're good at reducing income taxes. Many states offer income tax deductions on 529 contributions, and we already went through the New York example. Tax-free growth. 529 investments grow tax-free, just like in a 401k or in an IRA. There's no annual tax on dividends. There's no tax on interest. If you sell the investments inside a 529, there's no capital gains, so long as you eventually use the money for educational purposes. Now, this leaves more dollars behind, right? The less tax you pay, the more dollars are left behind to grow and compound extra compound interest. That's a good thing. If we apply these two tax advantages to a reasonable scenario, I'll link to this article in the show notes for the 50-50 rule. And there's a Google sheet we can link to as well that shows this math, where it's realistic to expect a 529 account to result in a 15 to 20% extra dollars for college when compared to a taxable brokerage account. So if you assume that someone saves for 15 years of their children's lives, they're saving for college at a reasonable amount every year, 529 accounts, the tax savings can end up being really significant, an extra 15 or 20%. But if we look at the other side of the aisle, at taxable brokerage accounts, we'll see that they have some distinct advantages over 529s, namely on flexibility and the idea of having frozen assets. Taxable accounts are very flexible. You can withdraw from them at any time, just like, for example, during an unexpected emergency. You couldn't tap into your 529 plan, but you can tap into a taxable brokerage account. $529 must be spent on educational expenses, cannot be withdrawn for other reasons. What if your kid decides to skip college? Well, unused funds in a 529 can be basically impossible to withdraw without paying taxes and penalties, whereas taxable accounts avoid that situation. Now, in case it ever comes up in your situation or in your conversations, every 529 withdrawal, whether for educational purposes or not, is made pro rata between your contributions and your earnings. The contributions are never taxed and never penalized, but the earnings can be if your withdrawal is not for a qualified educational expense. Now, for example, let's say your 529 plan has $100,000 of contributions and $50,000 of earnings. So that's 2/3 contributions, 1/3 earnings. You want to make a $30,000 withdrawal just to pay for college. You have no choice in that $20,000 of that withdrawal will come from your contributions and $10,000 will come from earnings because that's 2/3 and 1/3 again. Now, if that $30,000 withdrawal is for college expenses, you're clear. But if it was not for a qualified educational expense, then the $10,000 earning portion, the 1/3 in this case, will be taxed as income, which just is more marginal tax dollars on top of your regular income. So that's not ideal, and will also suffer that 10% penalty. And as I alluded to before, if you run the math, you'll see that the penalty eats away at all of the 529's tax benefits in the first place. So you do not want to suffer that penalty if you can help it. And that means we need to try to find a balance between 529 accounts and taxable accounts. How do we balance those various pros and cons? Well, the 50-50 rule is a good place to start. So let's say you aim to gift your children $100,000 over their 4 years of college. Very, very generous of you. I think that you should aim to have $50,000 of that gift coming from a 529 account, the other $50,000 coming from a taxable brokerage account. Now, we all know already that that solution won't be perfectly ideal because whatever reality throws at you, you will wish that you had decided to go all in one direction or the other direction. But we don't know the future. And that fact, the fact that we're all mortals and we don't have a crystal ball, it's one of the fundamental frustrations in all of financial planning. If we knew the future, right, we could make a perfect financial plan, but we don't, so we can't. Our best solutions, therefore, often involve hedging our bets. We'd rather know we're 50% correct than be surprised later that we're 100% wrong. And the 50-50 rule is one of many types of financial planning tactics that guarantees a middle-of-the-road solution. You'll capture some of the tax benefits, and you'll also retain some of your flexibility. If Johnny gets a scholarship and only needs 70% of your saved money, well, that's actually kind of great because you'll still be able to use your $529 completely, and then you'll dip into the taxable account only when needed, keeping the remaining taxable dollars for other goals in life. You'll be confident your 529 account will be completely drained, avoiding any sort of frustrating taxes or penalties later on. The 50-50 rule provides really the best of both worlds, provides flexibility, and no matter what happens, you'll know that you'll be in a pretty good spot for college savings. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, what about the FAFSA? After I wrote this original article, one person, an anonymous commenter, wrote in on the best interest on the blog, and they said, Jesse, your solution doesn't factor in how FAFSA treats these accounts differently. Well, that person unfortunately is wrong, but they bring up a good point, which is how does FAFSA think about these assets? Now, FAFSA is the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. That's what FAFSA stands for. And it looks at all sorts of assets going on in a family's life and income in a family's life. And FAFSA's is to estimate how much money a family can contribute to their children's college. Now, the FAFSA treats 529 assets and parents' taxable accounts precisely the same way. That is up to 5.64%, between 5 and 6% of those accounts go directly into calculating a family's expected family contribution, or EFC. That EFC really is the big number in FAFSA, right? It's what a family can be expected to contribute towards college. About 5 or 6% of a 529 account and about 5 or 6% of a taxable account will count towards the family's EFC. Therefore, the higher the EFC, the less aid you get. But the point being that both of these accounts are counted for in financial aid. And as long as they're in the name of the parents, they're counted the same way. Another smart piece of feedback I got from this idea is the question of, well, does it have to be 50-50? Now, I'll admit, dividing the two accounts down the middle, 50-50, it's simply an easy shorthand. You can choose a different fraction, but when thinking through what fraction makes the most sense in your case or in my case, my primary concerns are that, one, we need to be confident, very confident, that we are going to drain the 529 accounts down to zero. If Johnny's college will cost $200,000 and you aim to have all $200,000 in a 529, I don't like that. There's no margin for error. Even if you wanted to have $190,000 of the $200,000 in a 529, I still don't think that's enough room for error. Things can change, investments can grow more than expected, maybe a little scholarship here, a little bit of money there, and next thing you know, you just have leftover money in the 529. And that's something ideally we want to avoid. And then the second thing I want to keep in mind is that during the saving process, right, which can take 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, as we're building up to the point when our kids are going to college, I want to have a large enough portion of their college savings inside of a taxable account to provide just in case flexibility, emergency fund, whatever you want to call it, to the rest of my financial life. I don't want to find myself in a situation where college is still 5 years away. I've got $100,000 saved in 529 accounts and nothing saved in taxable accounts. I'd much rather be in a situation where I say, well, we're still 5 years away from college and $50,000 are in a 529 account right now. And the other part that I've saved, now I've got $45,000 over here in a taxable account. Because if the roof flies off in a tornado, I can dip into that taxable account and use it right now, today, tax-free and penalty-free. So the upshot of all this is that maybe for you in your life, maybe 75-25 makes more sense. Maybe 60-40 makes more sense. I can totally get on board with that. But for what it's worth, I probably wouldn't go much higher than anticipating to pull 75% of college costs from a 529. Now, let's work backwards. You can work backward from your future goal to discover what today's saving rates need to be. Now, in our hypothetical scenario, let's say we want to have $50,000 in a 529 account and $50,000 in a taxable account for college in 15 years. Let's say we have a 3-year-old child today. So 15 years from now, we want to have $100,000 and we're going to split it 50-50 between a 529 and a taxable account. You can plug that into a spreadsheet, assume a reasonable conservative rate of return, and you can get to a starting point that says you need to put $2,000 per year into each account or $170 per month into each account. Great. That's just how the math shakes out in this case. Now, depending on your timeline and what you want to assume for a rate of compound growth, a simple spreadsheet or a question to your financial planner will inform you of what your savings plan needs to be. And that, quite simply, is the 50-50 rule for college saving. And then I wanted to dip into one more interesting 529 conversation before Evan Giokas joins us. I want to talk about the important details behind the 529 to Roth conversions. Now, if you haven't heard about this, the Secure 2.0 Act passed in 2022. It featured many new tax and investing rules, and one of the most publicized changes is that people can now convert $529 into Roth IRA dollars. It's a very popular idea because, as we just talked about with the 50-50 rule, traditionally, $529 had no sort of pressure release valve. They'd be subject to income tax and a 10% penalty if they weren't used for educational expenses. Now, this new rule gives those unused $529 a potential new path into a Roth IRA. But there's much more to this Roth conversion rule than meets the eye, and there's a lot of faulty advice bouncing around the internet. Now, as we've alluded to a couple times in this episode, the downside of 529s is that threat that your money will get stuck there, and that leads, the government, our legislators, to a pretty useful, important question, which is, what's the point of a tax-advantaged account that investors avoid using for threat of the downsides? And this new Roth conversion rule aims to fix that problem. So first, let's talk about some of the basics. With the passing of the Secure 2.0 Act, 529 account holders can now convert $35,000 from their 529 accounts into Roth IRAs. That money can then grow tax-free in the Roth IRA and can be withdrawn in retirement, also tax-free. That's a wonderful thing. But first things first, who receives the Roth IRA dollars? Most of the time, investors create 529 accounts for the benefit of another person, like their child. That child is called the beneficiary. Now, for this Roth conversion rule, the Roth IRA has to be in the name of the beneficiary of the 529 account. For example, the student or the child. However, that being said, investors can always set up 529 accounts with themselves as the beneficiary. And in that case, the investor could convert 529 money into their own Roth IRA. However, there are important timing restrictions here. The 529 account must be held for the designated beneficiary for at least 15 years before it's eligible for Roth conversion. If you start a 529 account today in April of 2024, it won't be eligible for Roth conversion until 2039. And the reason here, quite simply, is because the government wasn't really interested in creating a shortcut. They weren't interested in creating a hack where today I can create a 529 account, I can load it with money, and then tomorrow I can do a Roth conversion. No. They essentially want, quote unquote, honest use of this new rule. The 15-year rule means it's actually going to be applied for most likely students and beneficiaries and the way that legislators intend. Next question, can the conversion happen all at once, right? There's a $35,000 conversion limit. Can it happen all at once? Well, the maximum conversion in any 1 year is determined by two factors. The first factor is whatever the maximum annual Roth IRA contribution limit is for that year. For example, here in 2024, the maximum Roth IRA contribution limit is $7,000, meaning if you were to do one of these 529 conversions in 2024, the most you could convert is $7,000. But then also, just like real Roth IRA contributions, we have to look at the 529 beneficiary's earned income. Did the beneficiary make any money this year? W-2, earned income, or 1099. There are many ways to earn income for what it's worth. Not a tax professional. But the maximum annual conversion from the 529 to the Roth must be less than whatever the beneficiary's earned income is. If you don't have a job, if you're not working, and you don't have any earned income, then you cannot convert $529 into your Roth. If you want to convert the full $35,000, which is the max under current rules, we can just do some math in our heads and realize, it will have to occur over at least 5 years, right? 5 years at $7,000 each year gets us to $35,000, and you'll have to earn at least $7,000 of earned income in each of those 5 years. Next question, are there any other limitations to this new rule? Yes, there are. Any 529 assets contributed in the past 5 years and their associated earnings are not eligible for Roth conversion. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, we already covered that with a 15-year rule, right? And the answer is not quite. The 15-year rule applies to the age of the account itself. The 5-year rule applies to the actual dollars in the account. Only dollars in the account that are at least 5 years old or are earned, right, or interest, are grossed from dollars that are at least 5 years old, only those older dollars are eligible for conversion. The next question, can I do this for my oldest kid, child A, and then do it again for child B? Now, if each child has their own 529 plan, then yes, you can. But if the Roth conversion dollars are only coming from one 529 account, it can be challenging. The 15-year rule is the main reason why. Based on the way the rules are currently written, the 529 account would have to list child A as the beneficiary for 15 years, and then you'd start a 5 to 6 year Roth conversion window, and then child B would become the beneficiary, which would begin a new 15-year window, and then a new Roth conversion window after that. It's a 40-year total timeline. It just doesn't make much sense. Now, here's some personal commentary, some of my thoughts on the 529 accounts in general and this Roth conversion rule more specifically. The 529 to Roth rule is a good thing. Don't get me wrong. It's a net positive any way you cut the cake. It's just adding more functionality. It's adding a pressure release valve that wasn't previously there. It's only good. But with in-state college costs well above $30,000 per year, and many out-of-state college costs more than double that, It's a small solution to what's probably a larger problem. The larger problem is that it's feasible for $100,000 to get stuck in a 529 account if we don't plan accordingly or if life throws us a curveball. And the Roth conversion rule only fixes, quote unquote, fixes $35,000 of that problem. What to do instead? It gets me back to the 50-50 rule, if I'm being honest. I think first, parents should determine a dollar amount they'd like to contribute to their children's college. Is it $10,000 a year? Is it $100,000? Whatever, pick your number. And then parents should work towards that goal by saving in both 529 accounts and taxable brokerage accounts. As we alluded to, the 50-50 rule or the 60-40 rule, whatever you end up picking intentionally splits the difference. Some of the money is locked away for college. Some of the money is not tax advantaged, but is perfectly flexible. The Roth conversion rule does add another knob to turn in our benefit. And once we get closer to college age, maybe we do want to sit down with a financial planner at that point and say, hey, we have X saved in a 529. We have Y saved in a taxable account. Here's how much we want to contribute or gift to our children to help them with college. Should we be thinking about this Roth conversion as well? One thing I didn't mention before that I probably should have is the Roth conversion. It takes the place of what otherwise would have been normal Roth contributions that year. So let's say your kid is 25. They're off on their own post-college. They're earning income. They open a Roth IRA for themselves. And you as their parent say, hey, you have this leftover money in your 529. Let's convert it from your 529 into your Roth. Well, if you do the $7,000 conversion for your child that year, they can no longer make their own contributions to their Roth. You can only add $7,000 per year into a Roth from one source. It can be from their earned income, or it can be from the 529. You can't send $14,000 in 7 plus 7 from both sources. So good thing to keep in mind, I suppose. And like I said before, this Roth conversion rule, I've been kind of poo-pooing it a little bit right now on this podcast, but the main reason why is because too many sources online are describing it as the best thing since sliced bread. And it really isn't. It's simply another knob to turn, a nice little pressure release valve. But I wouldn't go out of my way to ensure I have extra money in a 529 just so I can make the Roth conversion later on. I hope that by explaining some of the downsides or some of the rules and the way they're written today, you'll see that legislators kind of thought about that, and they've already made sure that you can't really use this rule that way. The 529 to Roth conversion, it's a good rule for savers and investors. It's important. You know it. You know how it works, but it has specific nuances that you'll need to follow, and it won't be applicable for every possible case. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Every week, I send a quick free email to thousands of readers that shares 3 simple things. 1, my new articles and podcasts. 2, the best financial content of the week from all over the internet. And 3, a financial chart that explains some important concept in the news that week. It's a great primer to boost your financial know-how.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
Well, this might not be for you. But I do hear you, which is why I make it very short, sweet, and full of only the essentials. A whopping 66% of subscribers read my email at least once a month. They're enjoying it, and maybe you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog. Again, that's a free, no-strings-attached subscription at bestinterest.blog. And with that, I want to bring on Evan Giokas into the conversation. Evan is the founder, and he was the first employee, the first coach, if you will, at the College Confidence Coach. Now that company, the College Confidence Coach, Evan's company, provides a unique service to help young adults navigate what might be their first major life decision. That is, where to go to college. Do they even want to go to college in the first place? Now for most, the transition from high school to college, and then from college into the working world, can be very challenging. These are the first experiences in which young adults have to rely on their instincts and their core competences to take necessary steps towards their true passions. Now, when I go back and think about my college decision and, what school do I want to go to and where is it geographically? Of course, how much does it cost? Finances. But then what am I going to major in? And why am I going to major in that? And what kind of employment do I hope to get on the other side? Let alone some of the logistics. Can I even get into this college in the first place? Now, what I really like about Evan, and what I hope that you all listening get from our conversation, is that it's a many-layered decision, and it's worth spending lots of time deciding that decision. It's personal, it's academic, it's financial, of course, it's logistical, and more than anything else, it's hard to ask a 17-year-old to make that decision all by themselves And what Evan dives into in just in funny and smart ways that I think will get us all thinking is the fact that we can extend this decision out over time. We can start asking questions sooner, and we can ensure that our children, our loved ones, that the people in our lives who are going to college, that they're making better decisions, smarter decisions that lead to simply better outcomes in their own lives. That can be better employment outcomes. It can be better financial outcomes. It can just be a happier life outcome because they've thought through this massive decision and they got it right the first time. And so without any further ado, here's Evan Giokas of the College Confidence Coach. Evan, thanks for joining today. And I was looking at your website and I was really struck by something, this idea that high school students, they're faced with the challenge of deciding what to do after high school. Sometimes it's one of the first big decisions they've ever had to make. And so even though this is a personal finance podcast, it's an investing podcast, and we're going to get into that side of the college decision today, we also have to realize that this college conversation, it's more than just a financial conversation. And I'd love for our conversation here to be this holistic resource for students and parents to approach the entire college conversation. So maybe we can actually start there. When you sit down with a student for the first time and their parents for the first time, maybe they're 16 or 14 or 12, I mean, what does that initial conversation look like? Because I'm assuming it's not purely financial.
Yeah, I would say at the very earliest, the finances get brought up after we've determined what the student and the parents' objectives are for contacting our firm and really getting an understanding of whether or not we're the right fit. The way that the College Confidence Program is designed and where it originates from is helping students navigate the first steps of the rest of their lives. And I think that may sound grandiose when you pitch it for the first time, but it really is the first time that they're faced with a decision that will impact everything else that they do moving forward. So for us, we get a mix of different families who come in. Some families are coming in and cost isn't discussed until, they're done with the discovery process. And some are coming in and their objective is, hey, we've heard that there are ways to negotiate and there are tactics to go through the admissions process to make college as affordable as possible. And that's what brought us here today. So I guess there's no universal or right time to bring that conversation in, and it depends on the family, but obviously something that we are very, very conscious of and trying to make the best decision from all fronts, return on investment, none the least of which is part of the journey and process.
Yeah. What are some of the common, if we had to focus on some of the non-financials, what
Sure.
are some of the most common ones you hear? Is it majors? Is it the job that they hope to fulfill once they're out of college? Is it my parents went to Michigan, so I want to go to Michigan, go Wolverines? What are those conversations like?
All of the above, right? But when you look at what we're designed and how you avoid the mistakes that end up leading to what I've termed for, 12, 13 years now as the college money pit trap, the way that you do that is by getting very intentional into what is my unique ability? Where are my unique talents? And how does that align to different career paths? And how does that align to different majors and, eventually different universities? We call this internal self-validation. And the way that you get to this really trusted and internal core belief in the decision that you're making is that you stop doing what almost everybody who's 16 to 18 years old does, which is rely on the advice of the people who you think know you well. And as parents, we never want to intentionally give bad advice to our children. And as teachers, you don't want to give bad advice to your students. But most of the time, if not all of the time, you are taking a stab at what your child or what your student is good at based on external factors. Well, they've always been good at insert subject matter. You should go and become insert career path. Or, you've always been inclined to meet with people. You should become, an attorney. You should become a broadcaster. You should become a podcaster, whatever that external factor is. And in reality, so many teenagers are starting at that point to develop, what they really believe in and what really excites them about the future and who they want to help in their future career. But they're not approached that way. And the education system in general isn't designed to approach them that way. It's systematic and it's routine and it's directional. And so I would say the number one thing that we help students and families with, and that I would lend my advice to any parent that's listening to the podcast today, is Do you understand your student from a cognitive, an affective, and most importantly, a conative level, which I'm happy to share some details on if you want to go into. And then from there, reverse engineer the process. Too often, just like you said, student comes in, I want to go to Michigan. Well, why do you want to go to Michigan? Well, it's Michigan, right? Like there's no validation. And if they understood the difference between the Ross School of Business at Michigan and, the Kelly School of Business at Indiana, even though from a national ranking standpoint, they could be two different schools, there could be something that's in one program that's actually a better fit from them that would yield a higher return on investment than another. And so a lot packed into, a short question that you asked, but all of those factors come back to, are you internally self-validated and do you really understand where your unique abilities and talents are creating a path here?
We're definitely going to come back to, was it the college money pit? Because that's just too enticing to ignore. So that'll be our transition into the finances. But before we talk about that, a couple thoughts. The Kelly School at Indiana, great name. My spouse is Kelly. I know your business partner, CJ, his spouse is Kelly. And very coincidentally, my wife, Kelly, graduated from the Kelly School about a year and a half ago. I don't know how she would have picked that, Kelly going to the Kelly School. It's a great name for a business school.
I promise too, that was not intentional. I had no idea.
Yeah,
we did not vet that out prior to the podcast.
No. But before we transition to the finances, I mean, some of what you just outlined there, Evan, it almost makes me think of, it can be hard for teenagers to really understand their own motivations. And I don't know why I thought of this, but I had this vision of, the 18-year-old who, instead of going to college, takes a gap year and kind of explores the world. And it sounds a little cliche, but discovers themselves before deciding what their path forward is. And it almost sounds like some of your role is helping that process or trying to get the students to think that way without maybe necessarily taking the 1 year safari, that kind of thing. But let's dive into, you mentioned a word there that I doubt many listeners are familiar with. It's conative. Let's dive into that for a couple minutes. What does that mean?
So conation and the theory of conation was developed by Kathy Colby. And when you look at her background and her story, she's actually the daughter of the Wonderlicks. So if you're an NFL fan, you've heard of the Wonderlic IQ test that they used to give to prospects during the combine. And Kathy's parents are the people and the originators of that. And what that test was intended to do and what it did for, as long as they used it in the combine, they recently just changed gears and went to another cognitive assessment, which different podcast. I think that, that was another mistake. But when you look at where the theory was founded, it was stemmed and rooted in the idea that if someone was cognitively inclined for a certain position, that they would perform at a better level or at a better rate. And Kathy's thought process was, you can train people cognitive. And that really struck a chord with me. I've always believed that most students who peg themselves as, not a good math student, or I'm not a good science kid, or I'm not creative. It's not that they're not cognitively able to perform in those subjects or those materials. It's that they're affectively or emotionally not motivated by those materials. And there's a multitude of factors that can lead to those deteriorating motivations. But when you look at the theory of conation, what it is, the belief and the understanding that before we have an affective or an emotional response to any subject or any task or any person, and before we start thinking about it cognitively, we have an instinct. And so conation and the conative assessment that we use with students, that we use with professionals, that we use with people in career transition is a measure for how their instinctive needs would synergize or sync into certain roles, responsibilities, and potential career paths, majors, universities. So when you say discovery and, discovering yourself, we don't think that's, some radical term at all. And you don't need to go to Europe, although I encourage everybody to do that at some point. But what you really need is a discovery of you. And so discovery is the nucleus of everything we do. And in the theory of conation and our conative assessments that we use are a fundamental part of our discovery toolbox. And so when we give students those assessments, and there's a couple of different things that we measure for, their conative abilities, their affective motivations, and then cognitively, where are they, in terms of their education, but that comes so far after. And when they get a look at who they are from all three areas of their mind, it becomes so much more clear for them to explore a potential career path, explore a potential major. And at that point, you take so much out of the guessing game of, well, am I making the right decision? My friends are going here. Should I be going there? I read about this. Is it something that I should have paid more attention to? Or from a major and a career point perspective, everybody told me I should do this. I guess that's what I'm going to do. It eliminates that, right, Jesse? So you're going through the process. You're seeing, here's who I am instinctively, and this is what I instinctively need in order to trigger positive and repetitive emotions, that are hopefully positive, right? And then that allows the cognitive to function at its full capacity. So it's the belief that you are capable of doing anything cognitively if it aligns with what your conative and instinctive abilities are triggering first.
I'm not going to make this about myself. I promise all you listeners, I'm not going to make this about myself. But as you described that, Evan, I do think of my own story a little bit where I went to college. Mechanical engineering was my major. So I have a bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering. I worked for a large aerospace defense engineering firm for 7 years. And why? Well, because when I was in high school, math and science were my best subjects. I was on the Science Olympiad team. I loved it. And even to this day, I like getting into the nitty gritty and I like understanding how things work and why they work. But ultimately, I didn't really enjoy the aspect of engineering that tends to be you sit at your desk, you do analysis work, you're pretty much working by yourself. Because I also really enjoy talking to people. I really enjoy educating. And I found over time, I ended up in this career path where the Best Interest blog and the Best Interest podcast led to my current career in wealth management. And I like it so much more than I was doing before. And I think the cynic might say that my degrees were wasted. I don't think my degrees are wasted because the ability to solve problems is something I apply in my work every single day. And I really like the engineering mindset. But someone could say, boy, you should have been an economics major or a finance major or something like that, a business major. And that leads to this concept of, granted, it's a little cynical, but it leads to the concept of, you mentioned it before, what is it? The college money pit trap. I'm not exactly sure, but I think, again, the cynic might say, boy, Jesse, you have 2 wasted degrees and however much tuition that is. But what is exactly that college money pit trap?
So the college money pit trap, and it was actually a perfect segue into it. So job well done. What you did is not necessarily the foundation of what the college money pit trap is because, and I guess I have to ask you the question, right? You ended up graduating with that degree. You didn't pivot at any point, right?
Correct. Yep.
So again, there's a couple different layers to this. When you look at the college money pit trap, it's the fact that most students in the United States don't graduate in 4 years, right? They end up spending the extra time in college. It takes an extra semester. It takes an extra year. Sometimes it takes an extra 2.5. Why does that happen? Well, it's because most universities are out there marketing the fact that they offer hundreds of different majors as if it's a good thing, right? And I guess from a variety standpoint and a selectivity standpoint, you would want that. But when you're going to a college and you're choosing a degree path based on the advice of someone who you think knows you well, and you get 2 years into it, say you did get 2 years into that engineering degree and you said, you know what? No, I need a finance degree. Well, the likelihood of all of the courses and the credits that you've accumulated at that point for your engineering degree transferring to the College of Business is very, very slim. So you've invested your time, you've invested your money into the engineering program at X university, and now you've had the aha moment because you're 20 and not 18. And, I really found what motivates me is, the ability to teach others or the ability to create this mastery or, this nonprofit momentum that I want. And I got to change programs. And then at that point, it's like, all right, great. Yeah, we'll get you into the College of Business. No problem. 12 out of the 30 credits that you've completed so far are going to transfer, or 20 out of the 60 are going to transfer. So go ahead and, submit the paperwork, and then you'll graduate in 2029. And it's like, okay, well, I wish I would have known prior, that I was going to make this transition and this move to the new college. So that's the easiest way to fall into the college money pit trap. But there's so many other ways, right? Not understanding what your powers are in the high school year, in the decision time, that you do have the ability to appeal and you do have the ability to negotiate scholarship, which we can go into, that they're not taking advantage of different scholarships, grants, loans, and opportunities that can reduce the cost. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get there, but your example is the number one way that people fall into it, because the longer you're there, the more you're paying. It's not rocket science.
That's a great answer. No, that's a great answer. Yeah, I can imagine, Evan, that parents and students, that's got to be one of the fears, probably especially for the parents, 16, 17, 18, the children are gliding into college, and the parent has to have this fear of, boy, I really hope there aren't any false starts. I hope there aren't 4 changes of majors and this 4-year commitment becomes an 8-year commitment. On that note of just the things that parents are thinking about on behalf of their teenagers, what are some things that parents can do to either increase the chance of acceptance, to increase scholarship or aid packages? I mean, how early should people really start thinking about this kind of stuff? What are the ways that we can increase our probabilities of having the college path that we want for our children?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question to unpack in a couple of different ways. So first and foremost, there is no right time to start the admissions process. And I, in any pre-discovery meeting I have with a family, tell them that if you are in high school, the clock started and the program began the day that you entered high school. And in a lot of cases, it really starts in 8th grade because so many high schools at this point will take credits from middle school that will end up being visible on the student's high school transcript. So at 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, you don't really think about college. And a lot of parents, know it's coming, and maybe financially they've started to put away, what they believe they'll be able to contribute to the cost, but what they're missing and where they could really start to get savvy is helping their students kind of understand where the talents are and starting to explore what different options may be for their future. And you don't want to put pressure on a 13-year-old to say, what are you going to do with the rest of your life? But, maybe it is enrolling in a couple of different summer camps. Maybe it is shadowing different, opportunities. Maybe it's just, watching YouTube videos about what a day in the life would be. And hopefully, you don't put your student to sleep, or you wouldn't put pressure on them to say, hey, figure this out. It's more like, hey, it's never too early to start looking at what this might be. So when you're looking at the admissions process, we love starting to work with students and families as early as we can. Now, we won't work with them in elementary school or even middle school. We do have a middle school program, but that's more so just monitoring and making sure that things are going well academically. But from the time they enter high school, what clubs they choose, what sports they play, what classes they take, what their grades are, everything counts. And I don't say that to put pressure on people. I don't say that to make them afraid or, to make them anxious that they have to be perfect from day one. But anything that you do participate in, anything that you do put your name on, has the ability to showcase on your transcript or your application. So you want to be involved in things, and hopefully you're fortunate enough to understand yourself conatively, affectively, and cognitively, and align yourselves in different activities that you could potentially see yourself doing from 9th grade to 12th grade. Colleges value longevity. They value tenure, in the things that you participated in. It shows a commitment. And the last thing they want is their retention rate to fall, right? So if they see that Johnny was captain of the crew team junior and senior year, but was, rowing since 6th grade, and that Rebecca is captain of the debate team, but also shadowed at a law firm. And I guess where I'm going with it is it shows that the student has been intentional with the journey that that they're on and that they've applied for. And so that is a way that colleges are able to review an application and say, this is a student that we really want to come here. So let's give them and incentivize them with a little bit more merit scholarship to reward them for their efforts. And that's one of 25 different strategies I can think of off the top of my head. But the point is that it starts from the day you enter.
I like part of your answer there. I like your whole answer. Let me start with that, Evan. But I specifically liked part of your answer because we have these balancing, conflicting kind of goals here where on the one hand, we want our children to be successful. We want to set them up for success. But at the same time, we want to be cognizant of the fact that we're talking about 15-year-old and 16-year-old kids. We don't want to put the weight of the world on their shoulders. And something I really like about your approach and what we've been talking about today is if you can understand your children, your students, you can understand what really motivates them and what they really want to do, then we can align all of these things in the same direction. Meaning if through the testing and through getting to know the student, we understand that, they actually are pretty well aligned for this idea where maybe they would enjoy debate club a lot and they would enjoy shadowing at the local law firm and they'd enjoy a service role where they're working as an attorney. And if those stars align, and the student naturally wants to start moving in that direction, And it also happens to build their resume and get them into the right school and into the right program at that school, then all of a sudden you're cooking with gas. You've got something good going on. Because some of the horror stories, and I'm interested if anything really comes to mind from your end, some of the horror stories that you hear from, say, my end of the personal finance world is someone who says, at 14, I had to join every club. I had to play every sport because I had to get into the Ivy School. And I had to get to the Ivy School because I had to get into Yale Law. I had to get to Yale Law because I had to get that associate job at the big New York firm and then become the partner and then become the managing partner. And next thing you know, I'm 45 years old and I'm burnt out. And from the time I was 14, I was doing everything in life just to hit that next goal, that next goal, that next goal. And why? What was it all for? So that's kind of the horror story. And sometimes it starts so early. Does that trigger any sort of stories or thoughts from your point of view?
100%. We call it the anxious accountant. It's in one of our publications. And we were working with this girl who came to us at 19, 20 years old. So fortunately, she had her breakdown prior to 40. But, her whole life, she had watched everyone in her family work for one of the big four accounting firms. I won't throw the name under the bus, but dad was a managing partner and, that was the path. And her brother went down that path and her sister went down that path. And then it got to her and everybody was like, all right, we'll see you at work in 4 years or 5 years after you get your MBA. Good luck. Went through it and got great grades and was masking everything really well, that this was the path. And I got into the university I was supposed to, and I'm in the program that I'm supposed to be in. And that's going to lead me to my job offer in another couple of years. And then the moment happened where it was a complete panic attack. It was a complete out of body experience where it was, I'm not going to be happy doing this and I'm not going to be happy, but I don't want to tell my mom and dad. And so kudos to her. And the story is that she reached out to us. It wasn't, a typical engagement where a parent reaches out to us and says, hey, help my student. This was a girl at 19 years old, 20 years old at the university that she was attending, Googling where to find support for something like this. Fortunately, we crossed paths. And then I had to have an intersection meeting with the parents to say, listen, I'm mediating this at this point by your daughter's request. You have her on a path, which I think, makes a lot of sense and brings a lot of stability. But I've profiled your daughter and she has initiating, improvising cognitive abilities. And in order for her to really fulfill her needs and where she's going to find success and long-term success, she needs a career path that allows for more improvisation, that provides an ability to be, more spontaneous. And I really suggest that we explore a couple different paths here. And mom and dad were both like, what? She contacted you about that? And yeah, she did. And things aren't going great. You should really emotionally check in right now. And they said, well, we always knew she shouldn't be an accountant. And I was like, so why put the round hole or round, peg in the square hole? Like, what were we thinking here? And it ended up being like almost humorous, but the fact that she, for 20 years, held that in and didn't feel that she was confident enough to express it or had been conditioned to think that this was the only path, the safest path, led to a total breakdown, which thankfully led to clarity. But how many people don't get to that point?
I love that story. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. Serious question. Why do podcasters constantly ask for ratings and reviews? Yes, they do help highlight our shows to new listeners. They help strangers find us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's totally true and a good reason to ask for ratings and reviews, but I have something more important, at least more important to me. I want to know if you like this stuff. I want to know if you like my podcast episodes, my monologues, my guests, the information I share with you and the stories I tell. I want to improve and make your listening more enjoyable in the process. So yeah, I would love to read your reviews. And sure, if you throw a rating in there too, that's great. If you like what I'm doing, please share it with me. It's such a great feeling to read your feedback. I'd love to read your review or see a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thank you. Let's think now. Let's pivot back a little bit to the financial side. I know some listeners out there have cost consciousness on the front of their minds. College is more expensive than ever. You probably know the data right off the top of your head.
Sure.
And so let's think of someone who is thinking about the bill, the bottom line. And some of the shortcuts, if you will, that I've heard before or commonly talked about, things like, state schools are cheaper than private schools. Community college credits are cheaper than most other credits, and they transfer in. Students, they can get college credit while they're still in high school. I'm sure there's some other kind of low-hanging fruit that maybe you're dealing with on a regular basis. What kind of advice can you offer to the people out there who are really worried about the cost of college?
So, couple different pieces. So point one, everything that you mentioned is true, right? There wasn't one thing that I would poke a hole in. Public college on a sheet and expected cost is less expensive in most cases than private school. You can accumulate community college credits that will transfer to some, public or private universities. You can start taking dual enrollment credits in high school. There's so many different ways, right? But when you look at the number one piece of advice that I would give anyone who's cost conscious, it is start demonstrating your interest as early as possible. A lot of these schools, and again, if you're applying to Harvard or you're applying to Michigan from out of state, that advice really isn't applicable here. If you're going to go to a school like that, you are going to pay full price. I guess another piece of reality that I should be talking to the cost conscious. If you want to be cost conscious, make sure your student knows that you're going to be cost conscious, because if they're going and their goal is Harvard and their goal is Princeton, and you think you're going to get something from those schools, you're in for another harsh conversation. But for, a student who doesn't know where they want to go and they're going to explore, a multitude of different public and private universities, most of those tuitions are negotiable. And the way that they become more and more negotiable beyond putting together an application that is, admirable by the admissions committee who's reviewing it, you do have the ability to connect with the admissions board or your regional admission advisor at the universities that you plan to apply to. And by demonstrating that interest and starting to let them know that if you were offered the right amount, that there's a very high likelihood that they would get you as a committed student and a committed family, that's one negotiating tactic that we start working with really, really early on in the process. So to get it to something that's a little bit more tangible and something that's a little bit more applicable to the everyday listener, I would encourage everyone to create a list by no later than the end of sophomore year, maybe the beginning of junior year at the latest, that has a mix of those schools, that you have done your research, that you understand what the average cost to attend is, and make a list that is, tiered three different ways. Here are schools that we know are going to be financially more than the schools that are at the bottom of the list. And then the schools in the middle are the ones that we feel we might have the most negotiating power in. So be very transparent with that with your child, as they're going through the process. And also do your research. I mean, most of these schools at this point are under a lot more pressure than they've ever been before. Have you ever heard of University of the People?
No. What is that?
After you're done listening to the podcast, or if you want to hop on your browser on your phone right now, Google University of the People. It is a fully accredited bachelor's or master's degree that you get in under 2.5 years for about $3,000. The courses that you take are actually courses from Harvard, from University of Washington, from Northeastern, from highly accredited institutions. And it's all there for you. There's no live lectures. You have to be there at this time. You just get through, but it's an accredited bachelor's degree. So as opposed to Southern New Hampshire or, Phoenix and all these places that you have seen commercials for the last 10 years, University of the People is really shifting the landscape, that it's a certified bachelor's degree with a multitude of different influences in your training and education. So again, 3 different points that I made there, right? Demonstrate interest to the schools that you're really interested in. Make sure that you're being transparent with your child in terms of what costs of different schools look like, and make sure that everybody is aware of that. But 3, make sure that you know what the alternative options are. There's so many students who I work with that I recommend at least exploring that as a path, because if you can get that in 2 years, why not get 2 bachelor's degrees for $6,000 instead of going and trying to figure it out but again, it's not a path for everybody, but it has shifted education, because if more and more University of the Peoples keep popping up, traditional universities are going to be forced to keep up with their own, alternative methods. Or otherwise, it's just capitalism.
Right. Yeah, totally. It's competition. And it's a multi-$100,000 decision in many cases. So I think it behooves you to do your research and to really understand the nitty gritty of what you're getting into and why you're getting into it. And it's why, that it kind of comes full circle with the college money pit trap and this idea of, you really want to try to avoid those false starts. You want to try to avoid that anxious accountant who gets 2 years in and has a mental breakdown. And all of these things that we're talking about really are related, right? The finances are related to the students' motivations and the students' desires for all these different reasons. And supporting another thought you said there, Evan, which is the idea that, people need to be honest with themselves. You use the word transparent a couple times. That's something that I see on my end when we're helping people. A lot of times the questions that we help answer are things like, how much should I be putting in my 529 right now? Jimmy is 4 and Carol, she's 2. How much do we need to put in a 529 today? Great questions. We're happy to help answer those questions. But a lot of it comes down to, well, let's be honest. Let's talk about what the prices of colleges might be in 10 or 15 years. Let's talk about how much you want to help your children versus how much you expect them to take on, say, in loans. And maybe we can come back to loans in a few minutes. But that idea of transparency, I think, is very important. But another common question that I'm curious how much you help and how much you work with, Evan, is the FAFSA. Can you really briefly just maybe describe to the audience who's unfamiliar, just real quick, what the FAFSA is? And then are there anything that parents can do to quote unquote optimize? Now, not necessarily defraud. We don't want to do anything illegal, but optimize their FAFSA.
Jesse, you are bringing up the hottest topic in college admissions and financial aid that I've ever seen. I mean, I've been a professional since I created this business in 2012. And, I have an AACFS, an accredited college financial specialist, the mark. I have that mark on my pedigree. And, we've been doing FAFSAs with our families and filing FAFSAs with our families for the last 12 years. First and foremost, the FAFSA is the federal form that you are not necessarily required, which is a common misunderstanding, but encouraged to fill out simultaneously while you're applying to different colleges. And this year, it has taken a very drastic change. So I'll get into that in a second. But when you do file the form, regardless of the changes that have been made, the objective is to determine whether or not the family is eligible for need-based and Pell grants. If your financial circumstances, the amount of children that you have, the amount of dependents that you are responsible for, your income, your assets, your business farms, anything that you declare, if it doesn't meet the expectation of what's needed to fulfill the student's cost of education, then there's an opportunity for you to receive a federal grant, regardless of whether or not you qualify for the need-based once your expected family contribution is calculated, which, again, I promise I'll circle back to. Anybody who files the FAFSA, or the majority of people who file the FAFSA, are then eligible for the federal subsidized and unsubsidized loans. And so those are fixed amounts that increase as you continue through your undergraduate years, but it starts with a $3,000 federal subsidized loan and a $2,500 unsubsidized federal loan that you become eligible for once you complete the FAFSA. So that's the holistic view on what it is. And prior to this year, I would say that there were opportunities to optimize your chances at receiving grants from the FAFSA. However, this year, there's been a totally interjected change that has been implemented by, an IRS review process that you automatically, declare that you are comfortable with when you get to a certain point in the form, where it links your most recent tax return to your FAFSA ID and your student's FAFSA ID, and then leaves a very limited amount of questions for you to fill in. So previously, you would manually enter your income. You'd manually enter the tax that you paid. You'd manually enter what you conceivably thought you could contribute to your child's education. And you would go into your assets and you'd go into anything else that they would ask about on this form, and you'd be able to fill that in manually. Now, unfortunately, for a lot of families, that's not possible. They've done away with a lot of it. So they've automated it, which is great for families who are in positions that, hey, there's really not that much to report here, and there's not really much to decipher whether or not we should be reporting. It's not great for the student and family who do have maybe a more complicated financial picture. And while they may look like there's more money on the table on paper, a lot of those resources are being allocated to different investments or retirement accounts, or it's not necessarily there just for the students taking or for the college to say, hey, here's your EFC, which stands for expected family contribution. Once you get that EFC and the FAFSA calculates that number, at this point, it's much harder, but still possible to go back to the university and explain to them that you'd like to be flagged for verification and explain things in a little bit more detail to them, but it's far less likely than it used to be. So again, I don't know if I'm painting the most optimistic picture for our listeners today. I think things have definitely changed dramatically, and we haven't even seen FAFSA start processing until, about a month ago. And typically it would open in October, your EFC would be processed on the spot. Now they delayed the opening until January. Most FAFSAs and FAFSA profiles have just begun processing. So that's causing delays in admissions processes. It's causing delays in decision processes. It's really going to be a problem, not just for this class of 2024, but for the class of 2025, and hopefully not beyond that. But the changes that have been made have been so drastic that it definitely has taken away a lot of opportunity to optimize.
Got it. So to summarize, a big kind of fundamental shift in the way that FAFSAs are filled out by parents and by students, and that logistically speaking is kind of, they're working out the kinks, and that's causing some real ripple effects just in the admission process and the acceptance process and the decision-making process. But from a purely financial point of view, you're saying the old FAFSA had some wiggle room, so to speak, or there are some opportunities for optimization, and the new FAFSA, not so much.
Well, the old FAFSA was at your discretion, right? So if you felt that the value of your business was X, you're not going to tell them that the value of your business is 0, because that would be fraud, right? But if you felt that the value of where your business was and what it was evaluated at was less than what a form made to determine that it is, you were able to put that number, and then it was up to the school's discretion at that point to come to you and say, "Dear Mr. Kramer, why did you fulfill this number, and can you explain it to us?" And more often than not, it led to a very transparent conversation. I hate to keep using that word, but it fits, here. So you'd have a transparent conversation with the financial aid representative or the admissions representative, depending on whether or not you were negotiating for more merit or need-based aid. And again, now we should do a follow-up interview at the end of the summer or the beginning of the fall when the FAFSA actually is a little bit more settled. So we'll see how that works. But at this point, what we're finding is that the EFC that's being calculated by the new form is off the charts. I mean, just to give you a practical example, I was working with a family just yesterday who the father owns a successful business and, does well, but wouldn't consider himself wealthy by any means and has saved enough for what he thought that he'd need to contribute. But his son got into UC Berkeley, and he's from out of state, and it's a lofty price tag that comes along with that. And then he's looking at his EFC, and it came back in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he's like, how did that happen? And I said, well, because what they did is in the new FAFSA on your report or on your return, it took your business's gross income and then the net of what you paid in taxes, and it calculated that, hey, you can afford $300,000 plus to contribute to your child's education. Whether or not that's true is completely irrelevant because the form calculated it, and he didn't have the opportunity. So now I've told him with UC schools, I don't know how much wiggle room there is at all, but at the same point that he should at least formalize that he would like the opportunity to appeal that scholarship with the university.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Evan. And that leads to this whole student loan question. Student loans are almost a topic unto themselves. And actually, you mentioned coming back. I'd love to have you back on the podcast in the future, and maybe we'll do a deep dive on student loans then. So listeners, keep your lookout for that. Maybe it'll take us a few months, but just because we can't let student loans go untouched today. I mean, real quick, do you have a minute or two just to kind of give a very high level overview of what you see going on with student loans right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I'll save a lot of this for the deeper dive, but when you look at it from a 30,000 foot view, there's obvious advantages to taking certain loans. And then there's obvious, fundamental principles of not wanting to bury students in debt. And, with varied interest rates and the way that, distributors are attracting students and families, I think it's critical that families are paying attention to the fine print. And, I have so many families who talk to me about, well, loan forgiveness is here to stay. And, why do we have to worry about it? It's not the reality. It's not long-term. It's not a solution. It is going to be a conversation starter, I'm sure, for at least the next decade. But at this point, my very high level advice is that the federal loan that you're offered by completing the FAFSA is a favorable loan. And I do encourage almost everyone, regardless of their financial position, to take that loan. And if you have the ability to pay it back as the student is in school, absolutely do that and let the student pay it. Don't do it in your name. Let it be in their name so they can build some credit with it. But in terms of private loans and all of the nuances and missteps that people make with that, I think we should give the listeners a deeper dive on all of the dangers and the opportunities within it.
And we will do exactly that. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today. I mean, I learned a ton, so I know listeners will have learned a lot too. And now you're in my second adoptive hometown, Buffalo, New York, an hour down the thruway from Rochester. And I know you work with plenty of Buffalonians, but do you work with anyone out of state or in the rest of the country? And then on that note, if anyone wants to get a hold of you, how can they find you? Whether it's for the college work that we dove deep on today, but you also do some work on the professional side that some people might be interested in. So how can people reach you?
So anybody can reach us for College Confidence Coach. The website is thecccoach.com. For MGM coaching, it's mgmcoach.com. And we actually are thrilled, and this is the first public announcement, that we have just launched our third coaching company, which is called Thrive Together, which is relationship coaching, parenting advice, connection with your partner from a Conative level. So all three coaching companies are incorporating a similar discovery nucleus in the assessments and the tools and the exercises that we do to get there, with very different objectives. So you could Google me, you could go to any of the individual company websites, but Jesse, we work with people not just in state or nationally, but internationally. So wherever you are, the world is so easy to connect and it's so small at this point. We're proud to work with students in almost every state in the United States and in several countries outside it. So don't hesitate to reach out. We have the technological capabilities of helping, and we're excited to meet you at whatever point in your journey you're in.
Fantastic. We will throw those links in the show notes, everybody, so you can find Evan there. And I can vouch for what Evan just said, because we're talking via Zoom essentially right now, and it was a very easy, fantastic conversation. So don't let the geographical distance get in your way. And so, Evan Giokas, thank you for joining us on the Best Interest Podcast.
Jesse, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Best Interest Podcast. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email at jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves, and we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of the Best Interest Podcast. The Best Interest Podcast is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice and is not prescriptive of your financial situation.